was really late, so I got dressed quickly and rushed over to my car to drive to a grocery store that would be open at this hour. I did a quick Google search and found out that a grocery store not too far away from me was still open and would be open until 12. I had a choice of going to this grocery store that I've never been to, which was only about a 15-minute drive away, or to go to my usual 24/7 Servo, 30 minutes away. Obviously, I chose the former. As I drove up to the medium-sized building in the dark, silent night, my fear levels rose slightly. A deep gut instinct told me to abandon the idea of shopping here, and it bothered me like an itch that desperately needed to be scratched. I disregarded all of this and parked my car in the barren lot. The store was a bright light in contrast to the dark, cloudy night sky. The wind caressed my face as I walked to the storefront. The sliding doors opened and I was welcomed by harsh fluorescent lights and cold tile flooring. The lighting was bright enough to light up the place pretty well, but it had that dim quality to it that gave me a slight headache. It felt as if I had a dark, heavy shadow over my eyes. The slight buzz of the lights made me nauseous as I walked further into the store. At this point, I hadn't seen anyone in the shop, and I was starting to get suspicious. When I first walked in and found no cashiers at their stations, it had struck me as a bit odd, but not too concerning, as I simply assumed that all the workers were on break. There were no shoppers in the store anyway, so what was the point in standing at a register all night? But when no one came out after I had walked around the store for some time, my stress levels started to spike. I had been wandering aimlessly in the fruit section, trying to wait around for someone to show up and tell me where the sauce section was, but I abandoned that and decided to go to the aisle and find my tomato sauce instead. Just before I was about to leave the fruit section, though, I realized something very unsettling about the fruit. I don't know how I managed to miss it as I was pacing around the place. The fruits were riddled with small holes. It's not like the fruits were rotting and were starting to break down. No, they were fresh. It seemed as if someone had gone ahead and used a large needle to carefully poke holes all over the surface of those fruits. I picked up an apple and turned it around in my hand. Only the exposed side had those holes. Now this would have been less concerning if it was just that one apple that was affected by this weird sort of vandalization. But it wasn't. Every single piece of fruit that had an exposed surface was riddled with these small holes, no larger in diameter than a couple millimeters. And those holes weren't sparsely dotted on the surface. They were quite concentrated and not far from an organic sort of pattern like the pores on skin. The needle used to poke these holes must have been really sharp to create them so close to each other without causing the collapse of the fruit. And then I noticed some more minor details. The metal trolleys holding the fruit, also the metal of the shelves, had been scratched. Long, fine, concentrated scratches that seemed to have been brushed on the shelves. Except the brush fibers were probably made up of sharp metallic needles. I could have overlooked this as a design choice for the shelves, but the fact that the fruits had holes made this fit perfectly into the puzzle. I had absolutely no explanation for how the fruit had holes poked into them so organically. Surely it would have taken even a team of people a long time to pull something like this off. I was officially freaked out and decided to just go get my tomato sauce. My mind's response to such an unsettling occurrence was to just leave it alone and continue on with my day-to-day life. I crossed past the fruits area and walked into the first aisle in search of the sauce. There were no signs above the aisles to tell me where each sort of item belonged. Another odd feature of the grocery store that I decided to overlook. As I walked into the first aisle, I realized once more that every single item on the shelves were completely covered in those tiny holes. The whole section of crisps had the packets all poked with holes. The mystery of this grocery store was starting to run deep, and those holes everywhere brought goosebumps to my body. Frantic, hurried footsteps came from the aisle adjacent to me. I stood frozen in the middle of my aisle, exposed to whoever was about to turn the corner. To my surprise, the footsteps stopped, and I instead heard a voice obviously coming from their aisle. It was an old lady's voice. "Can you hear me? Are you in this aisle?" She yelled in a frail, failing voice. A deep panic ran through her voice, and she stuttered over the same sentence several times. "Yes, I'll come to you," I yelled back, as I quickly ran over to the end of the aisle and turned the corner. "No, stop. Don't come," she yelled in a scared voice. It was already too late, though. As I turned the corner, I realized that she was not there anymore. In the moment I had turned the corner, she had seemingly vanished completely. I stood there dumbfounded for a second when I heard her voice again. "Please go back to your aisle." Her voice seemed to come from the aisle that I had come out of, yet it seemed to sound a little distant. I ran back to my previous aisle, and it sounded like her voice was still coming from the same aisle that I had just turned into. How could I clearly hear her voice coming from there, but couldn't see or hear her when I made the turn? It was like she only existed in that one specific aisle, and walking out of it would make me unable to see or hear her. The only access point to her seemed to be that same aisle I'd come out of. "Why can't I see you?" I yelled back at her, as lots of questions went through my mind. "I don't know. I can't see you either," she yelled before her voice was cut off, and she started screaming. It was a scream that echoed in my head and screeched in my ears. "It's coming for me," she shouted in a panic, and I heard the sound of a heavy wet sponge being pushed across the tile floor. That's when I got an idea. I frantically pushed all the items away from the shelf to make a sort of window to see into the other aisle. When I pushed everything away, I finally saw the old lady, but her face was contorted in an expression of absolute fear and panic. She didn't even notice me as she started to slowly step back from whatever seemed to be chasing her. My heart was beating against my chest so fast, it felt like my rib cage was about to shatter. The constricting grasp of fear tightened around my throat, and I physically struggled to breathe. I broke myself away from staring out the window I had created, and instead broke into a sprint around the corner to get into the other aisle again. Yet she had disappeared. I heard the old lady's screams get cut off from the previous aisle. The old lady and whatever was was chasing her had disappeared, as if her presence was restricted to the aisle in particular in some unfathomable way. I had had enough of this place. I needed to get out. I ran out of the aisles to return to my car when someone who I assumed to be the store employee appeared out of nowhere. I stopped dead in my tracks and stared at him. There was something wrong with his posture. His smile was a little too wide, and his posture, it looked as if his back had curved inwards to such an extent that his body had taken upon the shape of the bottom half of the letter S. The guy said nothing, but continued staring at me. His pupils started to expand as he stared at me, and soon covered his entire eye. It was simply a deep pool of blackness, like an ocean at night. I took stumbling steps backwards and nearly tripped on myself. I finally lost control of my bladder when I realized that in the fraction of a second in which I closed my eyes to blink, the store employee suddenly had strange pulsating black tentacles coming out of his back. They seemed to be covered in millions and millions of tiny black fibers that all ended in sharp points. All the pieces fit together, and the holes all over the grocery store now made sense. I quickly got back onto my feet and ran away from the store employee. His tentacles kept on extending to chase after me, and one of them slapped me in the back. The impact of those 1,000 tiny needles quickly whipping me in the back generated an excruciating amount of pain. It felt as if my entire back had been shredded into pieces. I don't know what it was that kept me running, but the pain didn't stop me. I ran and ran until I found myself out of the grocery store and in my car. I collapsed in my car seat and fell unconscious as soon as I locked the doors. I woke up in the morning outside the same grocery store. The lights inside were still on, and as I looked closely, the same store employee was staring at me through the glass double doors. I booked it out of the parking lot, the fastest I've ever done in my life. On the way home, I finally broke down from all the stress and fear I had experienced over the past 24 hours and had a full-blown panic attack. What concerned me the most was that my back had no marks on it, not a bruise or a scratch. It was as if that slap that I remembered so vividly had never happened. I still couldn't forget the excruciating pain I had felt as thousands of needles broke through my skin and dug deep into me before ripping themselves out. As I struggled to analyze my back in the mirror, I suddenly felt waves of pain pass through my very backbone. Then it started to violently curve inwards. The connections between my bones began to break and snap as I screamed. Inky black tentacles, with thousands of needle-like protrusions on them, began to rip out of my back and start attacking me. I'm typing out this post as I feel those constricting tentacles puncture my body, like I'm in an Iron Maiden. I should have just had the pasta without sauce.